Russia has attacked Ukraine. This is a brutal act of war. Peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history.
Putin declares war on Ukraine.
Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is putting countless innocent lives at risk.
NATO vows to push back. But what does this mean for the people of Ukraine, for the unsanctioned church, and the freedom of religion in that country? Meanwhile, Afghanistan continues to face the grim realities of life under Taliban rule.
The children of Afghanistan are facing a dire humanitarian emergency that is only getting worse.
Should Canada do more? Afghanistan, now the most dangerous place to be a Christian, surpassing North Korea, which has long held that position on the World Watch list. And the European Evangelical Alliance says Ukraine is where the church suffers the most in all of Europe. How are Christians on the ground impacted in the aftermath of Afghanistan's war and as Russia invades Ukraine? This week on Context, Keeping the Peace. What is Canada's role in global conflicts? Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. Russian troops on the east, north, and south borders of Ukraine are raising alarms that Russia is ready to attack Ukraine. Here to help us explain the situation is Andrew Rasoulis. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Maggie. Thank you for having me on your show.
Why is Russia threatening to invade Ukraine?
For Putin, his primary objective has been, since 2000, when he assumed the presidency of Russia, was to rebuild Russia as a great power. Basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia had been on a downward slide, and the 90s and the Yeltsin period were extremely difficult for Russia. So Putin modeled not on the Soviet Union, which had collapsed, and he found that was a great tragedy, as he said so, but rather on Imperial Russia. That is his sort of a model that he's trying to go for. And Ukraine forms an existential part of what was Imperial Russia, as well as the Soviet Union. And so with Ukraine trying to make a move toward the West to join NATO, the European Union, after all these other countries that were formerly part of Imperial Russia or the Warsaw Pact have already gone to NATO, Putin felt that he could not accept any further NATO enlargement, and he made this his red line. And so consequently, they have been negotiating in a semi-state of war since 2015 with the Ukrainians about the breakaway regions, which came in 2015. And after 7 years of failed negotiations, inability to move the Ukrainians forward where the Russians wanted them to be with a semi-autonomous status for the Donbass, which is the object of today's discussion, the Russians got frustrated and said, okay, that's enough. It's off the table. We're not talking about returning these territories to you, Ukraine. We are going to recognize them as independent republics, with the option of one day actually formally integrating them into Russia proper. That's where we're at today. But it's all about Russia as a great power and Ukraine as a neutral state. What's left of you? I mean, there's a section of Ukraine now is gone, the Donbass and Crimea, but Putin still is not. That's not enough. He wants the rest of Ukraine to be a neutral buffer state. Okay. And that is the object of the current challenge.
Before we move on to Afghanistan, one other question on the Ukraine front. Explain to me the complexities of NATO and other countries' involvement in this conflict.
So, great question. Ukraine is not a member of NATO,
right,
but it is a partner of NATO. It's something called the Partnership for Peace, which means that NATO does not have the famous Article 5 obligation to defend Ukraine in the event of attack by Russia. And that has been stated very clearly. On the other hand, Ukraine does receive training and assistance and equipment from certain voluntary NATO members like Canada and the United States and so on, who actually provide training and support. So Canada is doing that for Ukraine, but it is not in any obligation, nor will it commit forces in a war against Russia.
Turning now to Afghanistan, the Taliban quickly took control in August. It's only been a couple of months, and already there's an economic crisis, food shortages, and people fear for their lives if they're on the wrong side of the Taliban. Is there any hope for Afghanistan?
That is a very, very, very difficult situation. Afghanistan is basically a failed example of counterinsurgency warfare. We thought after the Vietnam experience, which I was a little boy during that, but I was actually a player in the Afghanistan situation as an official of the Canadian Defense Department running a program there for assistance, military assistance. We thought we had learned the lessons of Vietnam about winning hearts and minds. And well, we don't have the time to go into the great detail of these lessons, but we didn't implement those lessons learned very well in Afghanistan. So we failed very quickly at the end because we modeled Afghanistan's training and assistance programs, not just on the military side, but on the civilian side, on the Western model. We basically gave them what we do, our framework. And when we started to pull out the resources after 2011, and particularly last summer, it collapsed. So their military could not function without continual Western support. Their Air Force became almost useless overnight. And basically they depended on their Air Force, whereas the Taliban had no Air Force. So we constructed them to resemble a Western force, and the Taliban were what they always were, a genuine indigenous Afghanistan force. Now they've taken over the government, but they don't have the government skills. They will run it like a tribe with all the problems that they have. Where will it lead? We'll see in the future. Perhaps at some point, the governance structures will improve as they might, but they'll still always be a tribal society. That is the nature of Afghanistan. And the West may over time establish relationships with the Taliban and provide humanitarian type of assistance to avoid some of the real catastrophes that are going to take place, are taking place on the humanitarian side. But that unfortunately is a failed Western effort.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew Rasoulis, for your time today.
You're very welcome. Pleasure to be with you.
Up next, we will be joined by Shoaib Abadi and Roman Sulvi to discuss the disturbing reality for Christians in Ukraine and Afghanistan and why the church is in danger.
About being any Christian now in Afghanistan, you are the first target for Taliban and for the people. If they find out about you, it's a big, like a death warrant for you.
In just months after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, that country has been thrown into a food crisis, in desperate need of humanitarian aid, not to mention the security concerns many Afghans face under Taliban rule. Shoaib Abadi grew up in Afghanistan and fled to neighboring Pakistan before eventually moving to Canada in the year 2000. But with strong ties to his home country and family still living there, he has had a first-hand look at increased danger Christians face after Taliban taking over late last year. Shoaib, thank you for joining us again on Context.
It's a pleasure to be here.
When we first spoke to you last here on Context, it was shortly after the U.S. forces left Afghanistan. You were afraid for your sister, who is a principal. How is she and her family doing?
They are, for the moment, it's like any other Afghan or any other Afghan women. There are a lot of challenges. You know that there is no job. There is a very limited that they can go or do things in Kabul, even it's a capital city with 5 million people. And yeah, there are a lot of challenges in terms of security as well. And not only my sister, also my niece and nephew, it is a challenging time. And it's a dark days as well.
Yeah.
Because you can't work, you can't go anywhere freely. And there is no actually cash money either. And there are a lot of hunger as well. Yeah, it is a tough time and challenging time.
Truly a loss of freedom. Afghanistan recently became the deadliest place to be a Christian, according to Open Doors. Does this surprise you?
I think I do not know what is when they say that number one for Christians to be, what's their parameter to come to that conclusion. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, that the recent changes in Afghanistan that makes it more difficult for Afghan Christians, for all Afghans and specifically Afghan Christians, because we see some stories where Taliban come and check the phone. What they call the smartphone, they call big phone. Check the phone and see if there are some the Bible apps in there or something Christian there, or also they might through the relatives. Yeah, it's a challenging time because Afghan Christians, basically what I say in these days, are doubly vulnerable. Doubly vulnerable, what it means is, one is that all the Afghans, they face all these challenges, hunger or unemployment or all this, and also on the top of it, Afghan Christians, they face more challenges from their own family and also from the government. Recently, a couple months ago, one of the Afghan Christians that he was connecting with us with our program all the time, he said, hey, I received the one from his own son, he received a threat.
Wow.
And that's a family challenge. Yeah, there are a lot of things. Yeah.
As a communicator who produces Christian content for Afghans, has the heightened persecution deterred people from following Jesus?
I would say, by your surprise, no. Because God is always at work. God is always ahead of us. And that's the encouraging part, that we see hope, we see a light in the darkness. And for example, 2 weeks ago, we received a call from an Afghan Christian woman, lives in northern Afghanistan. And she says, we are here in the family, we are all Christian, we are watching and we are praying, we have a fellowship here. And that's the encouraging part, that what we see, the number of calls, the number of people who connect with us, the number of people who download Bible, the word of God, it increased tremendously. And this is how God works. God is ahead of us. No matter what is happening in Afghanistan or other part of the world, God is always ahead of us, and he makes a way for believers to survive, for believers to grow, and for believers to be light and salt.
Wow. That encourages me so much and gives me hope for the kingdom of God. Thank you so much, Shoaib Abadi, for joining us today.
Lord bless you.
And now to Ukraine. While the world waits to see what Russia's next step will be, most in Ukraine are bracing for a full-out assault on the European country. While Ukrainians fear what this might mean for their country and their safety, there is also one group that fears what a Russian occupation might mean for their faith and the safety of churches not sanctioned by the state. Roman Solovey is the director of the Eastern European Institute of Theology in Ukraine and joins us now. Thank you so much, Roman, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting.
You are in Ukraine right now. How are you feeling knowing Russia is right on the country's doorstep?
Well, it's special time for us in Ukraine, because we would like to have some understanding what's going to happen in future, but the decisions of Russian government and the Russian president are unpredictable. So we feel some unrest, I would say, and some need of prayers and prayerful support to go through this period that we face now.
I know many people are praying for you, brothers and sisters in Ukraine right now, Roman. How is the church in Ukraine currently preparing for a possible Russian invasion?
Well, for the church in Ukraine, as you know, the last 8 years have been quite a difficult and challenging period. Yeah. Maybe you remember in winter of 2014-17, the Revolution of Dignity took place in Ukraine. And for many evangelical churches, this was a kind of special time when they discovered their true identity. Well, broadly speaking, before Maidan, many Protestants were still I would say, in a post-Soviet system of values. They were isolated from country social problems. So many churches were not interested in spreading gospel or doing any social work. But after Revolution of Dignity and following war at the east of Ukraine, many Protestant communities discovered the new image of the church as, I would say, a missional church, a church that recognizes God's presence in the world and brings hope to the people. So since that time, many evangelical churches have been actively responding to society's challenges. Well, I can say that our volunteers are working in the front line, helping to rebuild private buildings, schools, orphanages. They initiate different social projects. So since 2015, more than 1 million people have left Donbass and became displaced persons, and local churches often help such people to settle in new places. So I'm trying to say that current threat of an even greater war will not take the evangelical churches by surprise. We already have some experience in responding to the social and humanitarian needs of our people.
And obviously the tension there. As you stated, we understand that there is a state-sanctioned church, and then there are Protestant churches not recognized by the state or the government. The European Evangelical Alliance has said that the church in Donbass region in eastern Ukraine suffers the most in Europe. Explain this, why?
Well, back in summer 2014, Russian-backed forces of separatists and militants took control of the territory, which is now officially called certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And from the very beginning of this Russian occupation of those regions, persecutions of evangelical churches began. This was due to the Russian world ideology. It's a specific kind of ideology which guided various Russian-backed militants that started a war in the East. And the idea of Russian world calls for the preservation of common values of the Russian language, spirituality, the way of life. And for those people, all churches except the Russian Orthodox Church are unconnected with traditional faith. They violate the unity of Russian civilization and should be banned. Well, for instance, the self-proclaimed Luhansk People Republic has refused to register all communities of Baptists, Pentecostals, and all other Protestant churches. And believers could face fines or arrest merely for prayer gathering in private homes. So many such groups were declined of registration, or they declined to apply for registration. And the result is that many communities are now on those territories outside of the war. For instance, 48 Baptist congregations, they decided just to cease their activity because they couldn't obtain the registration. For many years, I worked in theological education, and for me personally, that was a tragedy that the great institution, Donetsk Christian University, was seized, and now it's just a military base, and the wonderful library and facilities were just destroyed and can't be used anymore for theological education.
This is a real live threat for Christians in that region right now. Thank you so much, Roman, for your time today, and we will be praying for you and our sisters and brothers in Ukraine.
Thank you.
So what is Canada's role when it comes to global conflict? The Q panel is back. Colin, Julia, and Calvin, thanks for joining me today. Colin, we'll start with you. Canada is a small player on the global stage, so where do we fit in when it comes to responding to global conflict?
Yeah, I mean, we have a long history of working with peacekeeping organizations through the UN. We have a long history of diplomacy. I think that that's primarily going to be our role these days when we think about conflicts like in Afghanistan or the Ukraine. The truth is, we don't have a lot of clout in many of those situations, but we can support our allies and we can try to attend to the impact of these really terrible global conflicts on people on the ground. Those are things that we actually can try to do. And I think that probably is our national role in Canada.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Julia?
Yeah, I agree. You know, when we think of Canada, we think of peace building, promoting democracy, security, humanitarian assistance. I think that's how it's how we see ourselves. Is how I like to see us, and I think it's how we're seen around the world. So I agree, those are strengths, and in situations like this, being part of that diplomacy and pushing for every diplomatic avenue to be exhausted, I think is just so important.
You know, on that note, there once was an Office of Religious Freedom that was established by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, essentially to monitor religious persecution and protect freedom of religion internationally. Should Canada have an office like that again? I'm going to start with you, Julia, on that.
Yeah, you know, religious freedom is sometimes called the first freedom because where it is limited, other rights tend to be as well. And we can see this playing out in a number of conflicts around the world today. So promoting that fundamental right tends to often also promote respect for other rights and freedoms. And, you know, the other thing it allowed us to do was have a real focus and expertise on the role religion plays in societies, in different national governments, and in conflicts. So we were just always in that, you know, kind of ahead of the game in terms of being ready to respond and to assist. So we had advocated for that office to be maintained because of that, you know, that focus and that expertise and that really good positioning. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And so I think, you know, if we say, could Canada do more? What should we be doing? Then I think reestablishing an Office of Religious Freedom would be a tremendous benefit.
Yeah, you know, Calvin, you know, as we think about the role of Canada globally, as we talked about being a peacekeeping nation, when I hear, you know, of our two previous guests, Shoaib and Roman, talking about persecution that they have seen and experienced both in Ukraine and Afghanistan when it comes to Christians, not to mention many other faiths who suffer under persecution around the world. How do we speak into that from a Canadian perspective on a national level from the PMO?
I mean, to speak is the easy part, right? I think the resourcing, or at least pointing people where to be resourced, to be effective, to affect change. We all have different opinions. We bring all of those things to the table with everything we fall through. But actually mobilizing, getting people equipped to do something in education and in resource, I think is very important.
Yeah. As I said, we heard from two people about how these conflicts directly impact Christians. Are there ways the church in Canada can support Christians who are put at risk when war and conflict arise? Colin?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there certainly are many non-governmental organizations and various kinds of charities that do support work or relief work around the world that help people who are the victims of various kinds of persecution, including religious persecution. One of the things that I think we as Christians in Canada can do, that we need to do, is if we're going to talk about religious freedom, which I absolutely agree that we should, we need to care about the religious freedoms of non-Christians as well. So are we helping Christians in places like Afghanistan? I desperately hope that we are. But are we also attending to the plight of Muslims in other parts of the world where they're being persecuted? If we're going to be for freedom of religion for one, we need to be for freedom of religion for all. And this is one of the ways that we as Christians can kind of lay down a line in the sand on this specific issue and declare that we are for religious freedom for everybody, including ourselves and people of other faiths.
Absolutely, Colin. I agree. I think Christians need to lend our voices to other faith groups. I think of the Uyghurs right now who need to hear and have advocacy when it comes to what's going on with their people group. So I agree with you.
Yeah, well, you know, what Colin said sort of plays into what I was saying about that first freedom, right? And how not just because we should care about the freedom of other faith groups, but because their freedom very much affects us. And, you know, so we could look in Canada, for example, at Bill 21 in Quebec, which is way out of topic for us right now.
I think it resonates,
but the importance for us to understand what's happening there, to speak to what is happening there, to get involved. We're still assessing that at our end. But again, because that is a serious infringement on religious freedom for groups of people in Canada. And if we're going to say that we protect and defend religious freedom, then we have to, as Colin said, be willing to step up and speak in support of the freedom of other groups.
Yeah. I was thinking of the Yazidis. That's what I was thinking of. I was thinking of the Yazidis and how important it was, I think, especially for Christians to be able to lend voice to that group as well. Okay, last question. Every year, we all read the World Watch List, and we're made aware of persecution of Christians around the world. But what happens after that? You know, so this year, we've seen how Afghanistan has now taken over as the #1, the most dangerous place for Christians to live. They've toppled over North Korea, and now North Korea is #2. But how do we move beyond that? It's kind of what you were saying, Calvin, about not just talking. So how do we not just look at this and say, okay, well, now Afghanistan's #1, North Korea's #2, and we just go back to our very convenient Canadian lifestyle?
I think we, as believers in the spaces that we gather, I think we need to communicate, as Julie and Colin have spoken about the religious other, right? We are conscious of our own, but we're also needing to be conscious of them. Jesus wasn't just conscious and kind to the people that he walked around. He was very benevolent. And I think in our spaces, we actually need to move and motivate people to get out of comfort, because comfort actually isn't an ethic of the kingdom, right? And Jesus spoke explicitly against it. So I think that's the first step. And from there, I think beautiful things could happen.
I felt like that was a mic drop moment, so we'll leave it there. We will end the queue for today. Drop the mic. All right, Colin, Calvin, and Julia, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I've heard it said many times, we welcome the stranger. In fact, the Bible makes mention of opening our doors and homes to those in need quite often. But with the increasing connectivity of our world, the stranger is now our neighbor. And while we are taught by Jesus to love our neighbor as ourselves, we see millions of those who share our faith, who have families, children, aspirations, hopes, and dreams targeted all over the world for many reasons, treated as pawns in a large geopolitical chess game. I don't have the answer to what we need to do besides pray, but knowing the reality of the suffering so many in our world face each day and not turning a blind eye to the conflicts that uproot so many innocent people's lives is probably a good start. Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think of today's topic. Join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing Context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.